Good afternoon. This is the National Council on U.S.-Arab Relations webinar on Syria. It's our second webinar in Syria in a row. The last one moderated by Dr. Fadi Hilani, who's on with us and coming in from Doha. But we're on today because Syria surprised everyone in the last 2 weeks, and we have historic changes taking place and a lot of questions about what's next in Syria, and that's the title of our panel. My name is William Lawrence. I am the latest addition to the National Council. I came in July. I've been working on the Middle East and North Africa for 39 years and have been teaching and running simulations on Syria at a number of local universities for some time, although I would not consider myself a Syria expert. This is a very important and timely briefing. We would like to welcome you to an excellent collection of experts that we were able to assemble on a very short order. And we would like to open this up to the audience later in the event and ask you to send your questions to an email address, not in the chat or anywhere else, but in the email address, questions@nkusar.org, questions@ncusar.org. And those will be fed to the moderator and then we'll ask as many of the questions as we can. I'm not going to spend a lot of time introducing our speakers. Their bios will be available on our website, both for other events they've helped us with, and for this event, we will post something on the website. We will be recording this, and it will be available, I believe, on YouTube, on our website, and wherever else the council chooses to post it. Our speakers today are Neil Quilliam, Associate Fellow for Middle East and North Africa at Chatham House, who has a new book out. I'm welcoming him to plug in a moment. We have Colonel Abbas Dahouk, retired, who's a member of the National Council on U.S. Arab Relations Board of Directors. We have Dr. Fadi Hilani, who's been with the council for about 2 years now, is Syrian, and is Senior Academic and Research Fellow in Residence at the council. And we have Charles Glass, well-known author and journalist, a broadcaster and publisher with decades of experience in the region, and I'm looking forward to hearing his insights as well. By way of introduction, let me say that Syria has just shaken 71 years of Ba'athist rule, 54 years of Assad family rule, 13 and a half years of conflict, which yielded by last Saturday, by my count, 7 armies and 6 governments, if you include the rump caliphate of ISIS. And by Sunday, we had 6 armies and 5 governments. You know, but those that are saying Syria is about to fragment haven't been following Syria. Syria is an ununified state right now, with different governments and different military powers that are already fighting in at least 2 theaters right now today, and have before them very important negotiations they're about to embark on. And I hope that our panelists today will get into those negotiations, the import of the negotiations, as Robert Ford, the former ambassador, U.S. ambassador to Syria, who was on international media, I believe yesterday, was saying, and he worked a lot with the opposition and has a strong reputation for that, Syrians are not used to compromising. They're not used to making political deals, maybe military deals, and there were a lot of those before the latest events, but not necessarily political deals. And there's a lot of political deal making that he said Syrians are going to have to learn very quickly how to do. You know, given that context, though, I mean, if you look at the images from the prison and the torture chambers and the jubilant Syrians. We're at one of those regionally historical moments few anticipated, and no one quite knows what to make of. And the jubilation of Syrians crisscrossing the region in sort of ecstatic moments of joy is what no one thought they would be seeing this month. I doubt even Dr. Hilani, with his vast knowledge and Syrian background, was expecting this shortly after his last webinar. And so we're at if not a world historical moment, a regional historical moment of huge import, which will have impact on all of the countries around it. And hopefully we'll be hearing more about that today. But I think the biggest piece of it, from my outsider point of view, is that Syrians now have freedom, and they're rejoicing in that freedom. But of course, with freedom comes responsibility. What are the responsibilities of Syrians to each other? And I'll just throw one other thing out there by way of introduction. Everyone's talking about Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and whether they're good or bad, and they're on the terrorist lists of the U.S., UN, Russia, and others. Whether they're able to shake their jihadist DNA and become something new. But on the other hand, they've already made deals with the other militias. They've already been recognizing other ethnic and religious groups and governing in Idlib, with a mixed record. But one thing that's clear to me is they think they can bring this all together. They think they can open up to the world and bring Syrians together, and the support of the international community and Syrians want that to happen. I mean, it's just amazing to me how confident a lot of Syrians are that this is possible right now, a confidence I see lacking in a lot of the outside analysis. So with that introduction, let me turn to, let me just say once again, please send your questions, and I'll say this more than once, to questions at NCUSAR, Nakusar, so questions at ncusar.org. And let me turn to Neil Quilliam and start with a question. Neil, one analyst was saying, and something I was watching today, that you never know when a volcano is going to erupt, but it was going to erupt. Whereas other ones are saying everybody missed this. The intelligence services missed this. No one knew it was going to happen. My question for you is: did you see this coming? What did you see inevitably coming? And what's on your mind during this incredibly important moment of transition right now?
Thank you for the question. Thank you for the invitation to speak. No, I didn't see this coming. I mean, that's the simple answer. But there has to be a but there. I mean, we talk about frozen conflict. Well, that's part of the language. And frozen conflict, as I recall, kind of comes from the Cold War. When you had the end of the Cold War, you had the unfrozen conflicts. I think we had a pause in the conflict in Syria rather than a frozen conflict. So conflict was going to come at some point. It's a little bit like when we talk about the West Bank and we talk about the status quo in the Palestinian territory. There's no status quo whatsoever. Things are shifting, things are moving. It's going to come. So I did expect new rounds of conflict at some point, and we'd seen protests in the country elsewhere, so there were indications, but absolutely no idea that this was going to take this shape, this form, this pace. I mean, everything has been so quick moving. I mean, even before joining this conversation, we have to keep updating ourselves because things are happening so quickly on the ground. So I can't claim. I'm not sure many.
We had one prime minister on Sunday and then another one on Monday, and the first one was supposed to stick around. Yeah.
That's right. So there you go. And then I mean, this is an historic moment. I mean, we need the whole 90 minutes to sort of pick that apart and look at what's going on. But I think the one sort of abiding thought that I have at the moment is, was the euphoria, and that first 48 hours and contacting all my Syrian friends, basically congratulating them, getting some, and nearly everyone sort of said, this is our next 24 hours, 48 hours. We want to bask in this, but we are going to wake up in 48 hours time. We know, nobody needs to tell us. You don't need to tell us it's going to be difficult. The road is going to be very rocky. Let us enjoy this 48 hours. We're going to deal with this. And I think for me, the overbiding thing isn't what happens now is and should be, a Syrian-led process. I mean, you've described the domestic situation in the country. It has to be domestic-led. I just put a piece up on Chatham House earlier today saying Syria must lead this process and the international community should be there to support, but it can't be there, obviously, to lead. This has to be something that comes from Syria. So that would be my kind of opening thought.
Abbas, I'm going to ask for your opening thoughts, but what I want you to include in your response is, the Israelis have hit 300 targets. The Turks have hit multiple targets in Minbej and that area around there. There's the coalition, if you can call it that, the Syrian coalition just took back Deir Zor, from the Eastern Army, and the Americans have done at least 120 strikes in their area. So you have, in the context of what Neil just said, you have these international armies already fighting with preventive actions, let's call it, various types of prevention. So over to you, Abbas. What should we be most concerned about right now? And given the international actors, how can this become a Syrian-led process if these international actors are already asserting their interests in Syria?
Well, thanks. I mean, this is the $1 million question right now, right? What's our concerns and what's next? I'll start. I agree with Neil that was a surprise for everybody, right? From us looking from the outside. But I don't think it was a surprise on the inside. I mean, Turk's been training these, arming the HTS for a while, try to consolidate. HTS been consolidating powers for a period of time. And I'm pretty sure the Russians also were watching, and also the Assad regime, the President Assad, he somewhat know that something is coming. The surprise is, I think, came fast. And the surprise that we call it, the HTS had what we call it sometimes in the military is a catastrophic success. And that was a catastrophic for everybody, for HTS, because now they own Syria. What to do with it, how to govern it, that's a problem for them. And also for, seeing the Assad regime, Assad himself left the country. The surprising to me from a military perspective, I thought maybe the Syrian army, we saw them pulling back from Aleppo down to Homs and Halab, moving down to Damascus. I thought maybe they're going to regroup, reorganize, and basically Damascus becomes the final protective fire for the Assad regime. But they just withered away. They just melted away, did not fight at all. And that was surprising. And then the icing on the cake, where Assad, just like in Afghanistan, Afghan president left the Afghan army to fend themselves against the Taliban. He did the same thing. He ended up leaving the country, and also not staying and to defend his regime. So I think those are surprising elements in this. And so yes, like you mentioned earlier, that Syria is ununified. I mean, obviously now we're looking at multiple. You still have the Turks involved in there. The United States definitely is not going anywhere. Russia is not about to give up their prime real estate on the Mediterranean, and also Iranians are peeling off, but they still have some influence. But most importantly, you have all these militias on the ground. I mean, you still have besides the HTS, the Haririshan, you still have our Syria Democratic Forces, the Kurdish element, currently at war, fighting with the Turkish militias in the north. So you have those two very, very strong militias, and then you have also the Syrian National Army in the south, in the Tanaf area. You have the Druze now in the south. Also, they have their own militias. You have like at least 5 very strong militias And these guys are not known at this point how they're going to work together, and none of them has political experience. So I think we shall see what happens next. I'll add one more thing because you asked me about it. United States just hit 75 targets. That's a huge mission against some ISIS targets. I think that would, for me, this is more like a message, strategic message to everybody in Syria. The United States still watching. We still have reach, and if we see something along the terrorist-related activities or something we don't agree with, we will not hesitate. We United States not hesitate to do so. And the other, you also mentioned the Israelis. That's also very unprecedented for the Israelis going that far into Syria. I think this plan for the Israelis is not a new plan. Israel has a plan like this on the shelves for some time. Even back in 2012, when there was during the Arab Spring, the Israelis were worried that the Assad regime will collapse. And they had plans like this just in case the regime collapsed. The plan was to move forward all the way to Sharm el-Sheikh and create a buffer zone and not allow anything to spill over the Israel proper. And I think Israelis at this point, they are very worried that if something happened in any Islamist type regime, they need to be ready to defend themselves. So I'll leave it as that.
There was a Palestinian writer some years ago, Fadi, that said he wasn't optimistic or pessimistic, mutafa'il, mutasha'im. He was mutasha'il, I think it was the name of his book. So in addition to the questions that were already asked, my questions for you are you mutasha'il? Or are you more optimistic, or are you more pessimistic? And what are you feeling as a Syrian? And also, what is everybody getting wrong because they're not Syrian? Those are some of the questions I'd like to ask you, in addition to feel free to address what I asked the others.
Right, thank you very much. So to start with, like to answer your question directly, I'm optimistic, of course, because the first hard thing of the job to get rid of the authoritarian regime, and I mean here, of course, Assad, was done. So the regime, which was like for decades, which is the main cause for the devastation, for the economic devastation, for the displacement of, almost half of the citizens of the country, is now gone. So with this done, like, I can almost know myself and almost every Syrian I know, very happy, of course, very thrilled with how, of course, fast this happened. And we know, and this came in the discussion, of course, the opposition have been training and they have been preparing for this for month and month and month. But what was surprising for everybody was when it started and how it started, and of course the way the Syrian army actually was defeated in that very much short time span. There was much talk and discussions about why did it started particularly 3 hours after ceasefire in Lebanon. Obviously, there were concerns in Turkey about the opposition starting a fight while the Israelis were fighting Hezbollah in Lebanon, so they did not want the opposition to appear as if they are doing a fight for the Israelis also at the same time on a Syria front. So the fact that it was a surprise, it was not surprising the fact of of the training or of the preparation, but as much as the time when it started and the short time span in which it was done. So with the regime, of course, gone, everybody now is looking asking themselves, what's going to happen next? So this kind of, I will say, happiness, if you want to call it, is not without some fears, if you want, some concerns about what's going to happen next. So some people had, for example, some concerns about the way this transitional government has been formed. So they say it's not kind of a representation, of Syrians, of all Syrians, ethnicity, if you want, and backgrounds. So number one, there was concern about how this government has been formed. Number one. Number two, the role of, for example, a future Syrian army. There were concerns about there is no Ministry of Defense in this new government, for example. So how is the new Syrian army going to be formed? Number three, if that army is going to be formed, like what is the role of the officers who defected from the army, from the Syrian army, from Assad's army? So when the revolution started in 2011, some even high-rank officers in the Syrian army defected, and questions now are those people going to play a role in the future Syrian army? And that seems unclear because there have been no like communication between those people and Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or if you want, like the opposition who are doing the operations in Damascus. So all these questions are there. So people are very cautious about like what's going to happen next. And another concern also is the SDF and the future role that it may take. So people are asking, is the country going to be divided? Is there going to be like an eastern part of Syria, which has, kind of an autonomy, and the rest of the country like is going to be like different from this part? How is it going to look like? Are they going to be unified under one national Syrian army? That is also another concern which people have. And the idea that the government is going to, like, it's a transitional government and is going to end its term in March 1st, people are asking, what is this government going to do in those 2 months? Very much what is important also, people are thinking about forming the new constitution, a constitution which is going to hopefully reconciliate, do some kind of reconciliation, address the challenges ahead, be very much a constitution which understand the different ethnicities in Syria, the different backgrounds, how they should be represented in the government, and whether the way a new president can be elected. So going back to the first part of your question, Bill, everybody's happy, but at the same time, very cautious and concerned.
One more question for you before we go to Charles. Libya had a moment like this. Other countries have as well. And a lot of the conversations I remember early on Libya were about sequence. And a lot of debates about sequencing were maybe drew the wrong conclusions. Some people were just saying, just work on everything at once, and because everything reinforces everything else. But do you have a sequence in your mind in terms of, humanitarian first, politics second, security third, like one of the ones I saw yesterday on a European channel? Or, what are you thinking when you think about what has to be done first so that other things will flow from it?
In an ideal scenario, in my opinion, and again, that's my personal opinion here, like things have to run in parallel. With a government which is, one of my concerns, my personal concerns with that, there was no Minister of Defense, for example, in that government. And if you are focusing on the humanitarian part, the people, coming, like the jails and, trying to, the prosecution, for example, the repatriation of people coming back from, Turkey or Lebanon, Jordan, all these like humanitarian sides are very important. But at the same time, you need to build an army because number one, we have, for example, that was mentioned in the discussion also, Israel expanding, in the south of Syria, like they are very much close to Damascus. You have also the re-emergence of ISIS. The last 2 days, the U.S. Army did more than like 75 airstrikes using B-52, F-15, and A-10s. So the re-emergence of ISIS is like another security concern, and that's a challenge, of course, which under a unified state with one national army, that will be like a main challenge and a responsibility. So for a government to be addressing the humanitarian side within these challenges, I don't think that is like sufficient. Everything has to be going, at the same time. You don't need to have foreign armies in the country when you have like a state, a sovereign state. So you don't need to have like Americans, Russians, on the ground. You don't need to have foreign armies. So for that reason, there should be a national army that is capable of defending the borders and imposing security. And for that reason, for a transitional government, like to focus on a humanitarian side without, working on the defense, on forming the army, in my opinion, that is something that is lacking.
So I deliberately avoided the alphabet soup in my introduction. But we have mentioned Hayat Tahrir Sham, the HTS, which is the lead group that took Damascus, but with a lot of help from other militias coming from all directions. You mentioned SDF. When you mention SDF, you're talking about the SDF of the Northeast, or you're talking about the SDF in general, including from the South? And when you say SDF, Fadi, which SDF are you referring to?
So I'm talking about like the Syrian Democratic Forces in the northeast of Syria. You know, there has been like some clashes between them and you know, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. Very much recently, they withdrew from Deir ez-Zor. So now, according to the most recent statistics I have in hand, 70% now of Syria is under the control of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, and what is referred to, you know, in Arabic, not only Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, but you know, the whole thing referred to as Idarat al-Amaliyat al-Askari, as they call it in Arabic. So obviously, if you want, the power and the influence where Hayat Tahrir al-Sham has more power is expanding. But still, SDF, as you know, is backed by the U.S. Army, and it gets U.S. training and logistics. So there is much concern how the national army, backed by Turkey, fighting against SDF, backed by the U.S. How is that going to work? What's going to work out? And you know, like, ironically, you know, the U.S. and Turkey are allies, are NATO allies, backing, you know, two different factions on the ground in Syria. So there is very much like concern here, like, how is that going to work out eventually? What's going to happen with the SDF? Is it going to be part of like the Syrian National Army? Is it going to be what? So yeah.
3 questions for Fadi. Let me just also say that what he referred to in Arabic is the Military Operations Command, I believe, which brings together HTS and SNA, and he referred to it as the National Army. And the SNA, the Syrian National Army, is the one most backed by Turkey, even though Abbas was right that both HTS and SNA received Turkish training, whereas SDF gets largely American training, although there have been other countries involved in training the SDF as well. I think Norway was involved at some point. Go ahead.
And just very quickly to this point, Bill, the US is very critical about those two. So the HTS is categorized as a terrorist organization, and SNA, the Syrian National Army, is seen as, you know, fighting against the Kurds, which is you know, a U.S. ally. So the U.S. is critical about both factions.
Exactly. Charles, history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And I'm sure you also have ideas about the lessons of history, the things going through your mind as you look at the Syrian reality now, obstacles, pitfalls, you know, ways Syrians or the international community could go in the wrong direction, any historical parallels in your mind. But also feel free to address any of the questions I've asked the others. What's going through your mind as you listen to this conversation and as you watch the unfolding events in Syria?
As I watched the joyous celebrations in Damascus when HTS came in and the regime fled, I was reminded of the November 1970 demonstrations when a very much hated regime of Salah Jadid was overthrown by Hafiz al-Assad. And many Syrians came out on the streets to praise Hafiz al-Assad. That didn't work out, as we know. I mean, 54 years later, his son was overthrown, and it became a hereditary republic, which was not what a republic is meant to be. And the people who demonstrated for Hafiz then regretted it later. I also remember how Iranians came out in their millions when Ayatollah Khomeini returned to Tehran. Joyous celebrations, universal across the board, left, right, and center. And now the demonstrations are all against that very regime. So the fact that people celebrate and they're happy that something is gone doesn't mean that in a year or less, they won't regret what's replaced it, even though they're pleased that something is gone. But what's come has to be better. It has to be cleaner and less corrupt, less oppressive, less harmful to the body politic. I think HTS is putting its feet in the right direction. It has been speaking of conciliation of all minority groups in the country and the majority of the people in the country. Only yesterday, a man called Mohammed Yasser Ghazal, a young technocrat from HTS, well-educated, well-spoken, went to the governorate of Damascus and held meetings where anyone could come and participate and complain and say what they wanted, how they wanted Damascus to be governed. So those things are all moving in the right direction, and they sound hopeful. But against that is the way HTS governed Idlib, which was with Sharia law and very, very cruel system of punishments. And if that's the model, and the man who was running it has now been made prime minister of Syria. If that's the model that they're going to use, then it contradicts everything that Hilani and his fellows have been saying in the last few days about reconciliation and about a modern progressive type of government. So we see trends, two trends, one positive, one negative at the same time from the same groups. So it is almost impossible to predict where this is going. On the international level, you have the Turks, the Americans, and the Israelis regarding the country as a free fire zone. I mean, nowhere is safe from their bombardment, all three of them. And the Russians are refusing to leave Hammamet Air Base, and they're refusing to leave Tartus, and they say they will defend both of those bases if anyone tries to attack them. Well, I mean, where is Syrian sovereignty? I mean, if their country is occupied by Turkey in the north, by America at times and in the northeast, and by Israel now in the Golan Heights, it already was in half of the Golan Heights since 1967, but now in other parts of the Golan Heights, where is the sovereignty with these international actors grabbing pieces of Syria and mistreating Syria at their whim?
Thank you, Charles. Before we go to audience questions, I'm going to go one more time around. Neil, I'm going to invite you to respond to anything any of the others said, particularly if you have a disagreement or an addition, modification to what something I've said or triggered something in your mind. But I'd also like to ask you a domestic and an international question. The domestic question is, what is it going to take for Syrians not only to just respect each other's communities and tolerate each other's groups and but to actually guarantee each other's rights and dignity, which is the sort of level above what anyone's expecting from HTS right now, given how they governed in Idlib. My international question to you, Neil, is about winners and losers. We're hearing a lot about how Turkey's a big winner, but then we had another reference, I think from Fadi, or maybe it was from Fadi, about maybe they got too much success too quickly. Israel is sort of a winner and a loser all at once. I'm hearing on social media about a Russian trap. We also saw all these Syrian military guys flee to Iraq. Are they coming back? But what are you thinking in terms of the winners and the losers and the narratives about winners and losers internationally? I wonder if you had any comments on that.
Sure, thank you. In terms of rights and recognition and beyond recognition and trying to deepen respect, I think Fadi's point about the new constitution is the place where the negotiations, the discussions around that are going to have to take place, and I think that's realistically the only place. I mean, those things are going to have to be worked out and enshrined, but that's not going to be a quick process, right? I mean, I think everyone's conscious of that domestically, externally. Nothing is going to be easy and going to be achieved in any short period of time. But I think kind of talks around a new constitution will be the framework through which rights will be recognized and hopefully enshrined. I think that's where it is. I mean, just one additional point, just in reflection to some of what we've been discussing, and just to add to that, what I am optimistic about, and it's how it's channeled, is that Syria does have a tremendous resource. I mean, in country, but also out country. Large parts of the refugee population. I mean, certainly here in the UK, have really made significant contribution to our country, and there's this great wealth of talent that can return to the country, can be part of this kind of, building process. And I think that gives me some hope. Little concerned about things happening in the UK and in Austria at the moment, sort of freezing, asylum applications and
announcing deportations.
Yes, yeah.
I mean,
that in itself is a concern. But refugees are beginning to return back, and I think they themselves have tremendous amount to contribute. In terms of winners and losers, I mean, it's on the surface exactly as you said. I mean, Turkey appears to be one of the big winners. Israel is continuing what it's been doing in Gaza and in Lebanon, and it's acting with impunity. It's compromising Syrian sovereignty. It's moved into the DMZ. I mean, but there's going to be a price for that. Yeah. So at the moment that might feel good for Israel, but there's a long-term price, and even a medium-term price for that. What I've been thinking about a little bit more today, though, Iran and Russia, and I think our colleagues have alluded to that. I mean, Russia, this was without doubt, a strategic defeat, I think, for Russia. But Russia still has those bases. Russia still has relationships with groups on the ground. It's not going to completely walk away. It hasn't lost that space. So Russia still has a root or an anchor in the country. And it's going to do all it can to hold on to that. I mean, questions I keep being fielded is, will the new Syrian government, kind of make amends? Will it somehow, figure out some diplomatic arrangement with Russia? I mean, it's on the face of it, it's hard to imagine that, but I mean, it's not going to walk away. So Russia is still an important player. And likewise, I mean, Hezbollah or Iranian-backed groups, however one wants to characterize that. Yes, they weren't there. They weren't able to support and stand up to the regime. I don't think they've all left the country, though. I don't think they've all gone home. I know some have gone over the border, but the Iranian influence is deep rooted in the country. I mean, they really laid down some deep subterranean roots into the country. So again, it's not that Iran is no longer an important player. I have no doubt at some point, those groups are going to reemerge. So there's so much to come out of all of this at the moment, and I guess the media in particular is looking at it sort of in black and white terms. But obviously, as we all know, there's a lot of gray there.
So at best, two questions: one about Russia and one about the South. I met with a senior former U.S. official last night at an event in Washington, who was quite sure that the Syrians are going to push the Russians out very soon, that Tartus is going to be needed for the huge humanitarian operation that's about to be started, and they have the cranes and the only ability to get all the aid in, and so there's going to be a big international pressure, to take over that port and move things in. Another analyst I was speaking to said the Alawites are cornered. They're on the back heel, but they're going to join with the Russians and defend the coast, and they're going to be sort of new army in this. Whither the Russian piece of the story? That's my first question. And are those two people very wrong? My second question is, that same first official I was talking about said that Jordan needs to play a bigger role going forward, and the U.S. should invite Jordan in. And that also got me thinking about the Southern Operations Room, which by my understanding of Syrian history was defeated basically in 1213, right? And then it suddenly just kind of reemerged, I don't think with much Turkish help. There were some different religious and ethnic groups you can talk about. The Southern Operations Group kind of came out of nowhere. That's sort of that fourth army that I mentioned in my list of 6. How did the Southern Operations Group sort of rise like the phoenix, from the ashes, and become a player in this? And what do they represent going forward in terms of Syrian politics?
Well, I mean, it is a very complex situation, especially when you look at the security, how to reestablish security, how to reestablish deterrence. That's at the national level. I mean, I'm very pessimistic there. It's hard to see a unified Syria, how all these rebel groups and also outside interests, somewhat merge together. So I think in the South, yeah, this is they're all playing a supporting effort. I think the major player there, and not just Jordan, is Israel. Israel has a stake to maintain that buffer zone in the South, and they feel very comfortable to work perhaps with the Druze community. They have worked with them before. As you know, the Druze are very active in Israel. They're fighting the Israeli army. You have, I think, over 20 killed in action in Gaza from the Druze community, and they are willing to force the Israeli government to help the Druze in the south. So there's some that's good news for perhaps Jordan, so they don't have to do as much. But you mentioned the Alawites. That's good because they're the wild variable at this point. Where do they fit in this? If the HTS or these Sunni groups decided to conduct revenge operations against them, that'd be a problematic. I think perhaps United States will come in to be in the middle of it. I mean, that's something from a military perspective or intelligence perspective. I see an alliance with the Alawites to fight against what we call a terrorist organization, HTS and all this, Al-Nusra Front, all this very Sunni fundamentalists. If they decide to make Syria a Taliban-like state, I think the United States will find a natural ally with the Alawites. And if Russia wants to join in, I think they'll be welcomed as well. This way, Russia will guarantee Russia that you will continue presence in eastern Syria, provide you arm and equip some of these resistance forces in western Syria. So there's still all this not known. It depends which way this HTS is going to go. Remember, I mean, the Syrian Democratic Forces, the Kurdish element on the east, they still have a lot of political issues with them. They're not united, so we still don't know how they're going to get together. So the multiple factions on the inside is still unclear. I mean, you have winners and you have losers, and you mentioned the winners and losers, and you have people on the fence right now trying to find out what is our role in it. That meaning the Gulf states, meaning United States, meaning Israel. All these guys looking out trying to figure out, okay, what's going to happen next. I think Assad, when he left, in his mind, that's I'm just speculating here. He thought that if he leaves, Syria is going to be in chaos, and he's going to look back from Russia and say, I told you so. I'm the only guy that held Syria together. And you let me go, and look what happened. So I hope he's not right there. But so again, security is important. I'm pessimistic that they can put it together. The Syrian National Army is already basically was not defeated because they did not fight. They just left, literally, just like in and Charles will remember that 1982 when Israel moved to Lebanon.
You mean the Syrian Arab Army, because the Syrian National Army is the Turkish background.
The
Syrian Arab Army.
Syrian Arab Army.
Yeah.
Back in 1982, when Israel moved into Lebanon, the Syrian army at that time did not fight the Israelis. They just pulled back and they left. And it's kind of the same thing. They're just guys that did not left, so they pulled back and they're gone. So to reconstitute this army I think is very difficult now. Israel already destroyed whatever heavy equipment they have, from aircrafts to naval vessels to big pieces of artillery, airports. All that is already destroyed because Israel worried about all this might falls into the wrong hand. So that's all destroyed. And if the United States wants to rebuild that army, I mean, the Syrian army has really no association with the West. It's Eastern-oriented army. So the United States is not going to buy Eastern equipment to equip them. And we don't have the capability we're not the right people to train them. And if you want to make it like the Iraqi army, Western-oriented, Western equipment, that's going to take a long time to have a Syrian army. I mean, and between now and then, we'll just have to see how these militia groups work together.
Another quick, short question for you, and I only want a short answer. Was it necessary to take out the Syrian Navy?
Maybe not necessary, but he's just that's another, perhaps also has a political message. You know, that's we're here, we're watching, we're not going to allow anything defense to be established without without any checks. So basically, it's not necessarily, but I think the message is what's the most important thing, not what they destroyed. But the other thing too, the Syrian army. I mean, most of them most of the officers from the Alawites too. So even though if you reestablish the Syrian army, are you going to bring the Alawites back into the senior positions? How's that going to work? So it's they have a lot of issues. That's just like the Iraq in the past with the United States.
Fadi, I'm going to invite you to comment on anything anybody else said. As the Syrian on the panel, you have that right. Last word. But let me also ask you two interrelated questions. It might be one question from two angles. But a lot of people now are talking about the Lebanonization of Syrian politics, or the Iraqization of Syrian politics. And Iraq and Lebanon are looking more and more like each other these days in terms of their political difficulties. You know, can Syria learn the lessons of what's gone wrong in Syria, in Lebanese and Iraqi politics, and avoid some of that and find their own way forward? And the interrelated question I wanted to ask is, one of the messages of the Arab Spring throughout the 18 countries where we had protests, right, was that young people didn't want to be put in tribal, ethnic, and sectarian boxes, and really saw themselves as, and their identities as being something else, as being global citizens, as being worthy of dignity and human rights. And a lot of what built the Arab Spring in its early moments was reconciling between communities that were supposed to not get along, and that's what happened in Syria as well. So, what are your thoughts? First of all, or part of it is this an Arab Spring victory? Are we 14 years into the Arab Spring? Is this Arab Spring? I guess we had 2.0 in 4 countries in 2019. So is this Arab Spring 3.0? Do you see this as sort of a part of the Arab Spring long-term effects, or do you see it in some other way?
No, I do see it as actually part of the Arab Spring. Many people said like this victory is 12 years delayed. It should have happened 2012 or 2013 the most. But of course, the interference of Russia and Iran actually made it possible for the Assad regime to, continue ruling the Syrians. So yes, I do see it, of course, as a result of, the revolution, which has started. But of course, that whole decade was because of the Russian and the Iranian interference. To come to your question, Bill, nobody in Syria hopes to see Syria another Lebanon or another Iraq, actually. Most people I speak to, and I know about, of course, what people's concerns are, like the division of Syria is very much a concern for everybody. Nobody would like to see Syria divided, neither on ethnic for ethnical backgrounds or religious or even sectarian backgrounds. And even to the best of my knowledge, the regional players, and I mean here Turkey, of course, are not interested in seeing a division in Syria. Now, here in the Doha Forum, for example, I attended a press conference with Hakan Fidan, the foreign minister of Turkey, and or Turkey. He was particularly asked about the SDF, and to quote his answer, he said, Turkey doesn't want to see Syria divided, number one. Number two, Turkey will not accept actually the SDF to be neither in close to its borders nor actually in Syria. And quoting him also, he said, most of the fighters in the SDF are not Syrians. We don't have anything against the Kurds, but it's actually a foreign entity fighting in the country, and we don't want to see this. So talking about like the if you want, one of the most powerful regional players, Turkey, that is backing the opposition, is having, and it's a strategy that, you know, the SDF is not going to be there because it could be one reason why the country will be divided. So to the best of my knowledge, there is nobody, neither in Syria or even the regional players, interested in having the country divided. Now, coming back to some of the concerns, and I mentioned something about the army actually, and the need to form a national army, which, you know, possibly will have under it all the militias, if you want, all the military representations of different kinds dissolved under that national army. Now, the reason why this is important is because without an army, you don't have a state, you don't have a sovereign state, and you cannot run a state with militia. Now, one of the concerns which I mentioned earlier is the fact that there is no Minister of Defense. And to the best of my knowledge, there has been no communication with with any of the expats, and I'm talking here about the higher rank military officers who defected, who are now in Turkey. There has been no communication with those people to come and help, you know, forming with their expertise, you know, a new Syrian army. So that's a very big question mark. What is the transition government going to do with, you know, that big concern about the army? Because after all, you need an army to have a sovereign state, and not communicating with the people who very much defected, who refused to take orders from the Assad regime to kill people, not communicating with those people who are, I will say, a cornerstone in the Syrian revolution is a very big concern. Another very important question to ask, and possibly, you know, wait and see, but it's very much important to have in mind the fact that how is that transition government going to conduct diplomacy, whether with the Arab countries or, you know, with the West? If HTS is going to be in the forefront of that government, there will be very much concern, especially in the Gulf, conducting diplomacy with that transition government. What is very important is that, and let's remember that the HTS is, you know, from an American perspective, a terrorist organization. So one important thing, in my opinion, is that all these political factions, HTS and others, dissolve themselves under one unified Syrian government. That is not HTS, that is not something else. It's not called anything, it's called a Syrian government. And that will make it more political, more able to be like the political, if you want, representation of the country. And that will make it less challenging for the Arab states, for the Gulf, and for the West to conduct diplomacy with them. Let's remember that still Syria is under US sanctions. So there are US and Western sanctions on Syria. And it's for the best interest of the country, now that the Assad regime is gone, that these sanctions are lifted so you can rebuild and rebuild the infrastructure of the country, reconstitute the state. With sanctions, you cannot do this, obviously. So you need these sanctions to be lifted so that you can bring capital from other countries, conduct diplomacy, work with others. And that work with others, you need a sectarian government, I will say, a government that represents all Syrians, a government that is not HTS or not something else. And this is why another important thing which lays ahead is that HTS or any other opposition faction doesn't take the forefront of the Syrian political scene. Everybody has dissolved themselves under a Syrian government. And that is, again, to the best interest of the HTS itself, because being a terrorist organization will not be able to, as I mentioned, conduct diplomacy with the West. And for you to wait for the US to be satisfied with your language, with your tone, and then think about taking you off the terrorist list, that could take time. So the best way to do it, as I said, is not to be an HTS, not to be like representing a very specific sect in the country. A transition government should represent all the Syrians, so all opposition factions should dissolve under that government. And that is something I hope will be coming soon.
Charles, two questions. Number one, and you can take your answer in any direction you want. What's different about Syria and Syrians historically, culturally, in terms of mentalities? I mean, you have a lot of experience in the region. What's different about Syrians and might make you hopeful or not hopeful about where they can take this. Yeah, and the second from Lebanese, from Iraqis, from Gulfies, from Turks, from is there a Syrian single national identity? There were a lot of questions about that in Iraq at one point. Whether Iraqis were going to be Iraqi, more than anything else. You can transpose that question to Syria. Is there a Syrian identity, or do Syrians feel Syrian from your perspective? And I assume that you're going to say yes. So in what ways? What makes, from your perspective, Syrians Syrians? And then the second question for you is, we haven't had a political reconciliation in Libya, and we haven't had one in Yemen. What we did get was international conferences that led to ceasefires in both countries. And it took Berlin 1 and 2 for Libya to get the ceasefire of 2020. It took a similar process in Yemen to get us where we are today, where things are calmer. What are your thoughts about whether we might need an international consensus building conference, including the Russians, on Syria? Is that even possible, before we can create the space for a Syrian-led transition?
To go to your first question about Syrians, there's a strong Syrian national identity and always has been. Syria was the focus of the Arab revolt of 1917, 1918. Syria was promised independence by the British. If the Arab nationalists participated in the war against the Ottoman Empire, they were betrayed. When the French came with their mandate, they cut Syria into 4 parts. They created a Druze state, an Alawi state, an Aleppo state, and a Damascus state. And the Syrians rebelled against it. The Syrians were constantly rebelling against the French rule in Syria. And they lost many, many lives. Damascus was half destroyed in 1925 during the Great Syrian Revolt. They have a very strong history of resistance to foreign occupation and of national identity that united them across sectarian lines, unlike in Lebanon, where fighting was always divided amongst the sects. And in terms of Iraq, it's not like Iraq. Its dictatorship, bad as it was not like Saddam's dictatorship. I mean, there was civil society in Syria. People did had social freedoms. They didn't have political freedoms; they had social freedoms. Women were not forced to dress in any certain way. You could go to church, you could go to the mosque, you could drink, you could smoke, you could do anything you wanted. So they're used to freedom, and I don't think they're going to want to give that up. And the people, I know many mixed marriages between Alawis and Sunnis, or between Christians and Druze. It's not uncommon in Syria. People do think of themselves as Syrians, and so many of them now who are refugees in Turkey and Jordan and Lebanon feel even more strongly Syrian because they've been displaced and they long to go home. So I think there is this very strong national identity, and I think it will help to keep the country united in the future, despite all of the threats to the country from within and without. And in terms of an international conference, really, I don't know. I think it will depend on how these constitutional talks go and what the Syrians themselves come up with, and if everyone is going to be represented, if old regime forces don't come back and try to seize power again, if the different Islamist groups, HTS, SNA, and half a dozen others, start fighting amongst themselves, as they have in the past, then the whole thing could dissolve into chaos of the kind that we've seen in Libya. We don't want that. I mean, I don't want, of course, I think Syrians don't want that. They want to carry on the euphoria of the last few days and have their optimism justified by the actions of their new leaders. And whether those men have the wisdom to do so, we'll have to see.
2 questions from the audience, and maybe just raise your hand if you'd like to answer either one as I read them. I would like the panelists to discuss the impact of recent events in Syria on Turkish/Azeri ambitions re the Zangezur corridor. There's been some talk that Turkey will extract concessions from Russia for keeping its air base and naval base in Syria, which may include concessions re Zangezur. Given Iran's weakened state, Iran is unlikely to be able to help Armenia at this point. what is the likelihood that the conflict will flare in the South Caucasus in light of what just happened? What just transpired in Syria? That's question one. Do I see any fingers up? Otherwise, I'll hand it to someone. All right. And the second question I have is any nation demanding that Israel stop taking Syrian land? So, Abbas, do you want to take a crack at either of those?
I mean, I'll take on the second one.
Yeah.
On Israel. I mean, yeah, there's lots of countries probably from an international law they will voice opinions on what Israel is trying to do, even though Israel excuse at this point, or that the Syrian regime is collapsed. There's no government on the Syrian side, so this engagement act that has been going on for years now is no longer valid, and they need to be able to secure themselves, and that's what they took the fight into Syria. They actually moved on. Took more land, took the high grounds all the way to the mountain, Chatham, forget the name.
They're calling it a buffer zone for the buffer zone.
Yeah, so they took the higher ground to basically protect themselves. Is this legitimate? Even from the United States, voicing also concern that that's not so in all European countries. But again, Israel is they can do whatever they think is necessary for themselves. You can criticize them on the international arena and go through international organizations, but they will do whatever is necessary, especially now because you have no Syrian government, and the person that is running the country of Syria right now is on the wanted list. I mean, he's listed as a terrorist, and HTS is a terrorist organization. So you can't really know which way they're going to go.
Fadi, if you don't know the answer, I was going to say, if you don't know the answer to that first question, at least tell us what you know about the Zen-Gizor corridor and how that relates to the geopolitics of the situation. And if that's not why you raised your finger, feel free to say what you're going to say.
So yes, for the first question, I don't see a correlation between the two, but I would love to just, address something in the second question, if that. So what I know is that the UAE and Saudi, they both have condemned the Israeli taking more land in the Syrian territory. So there have been international condemnation, but from the Arab world, but particularly the Saudis and the UAE have been so critical about this. The Israelis, on the other hand, they signaled the fact that there is no state in Syria, and this is why they have did like these advancements in the Syrian territory. But at the same time, Benjamin Netanyahu mentioned like the buffer zone, like the treaty between Syria and Israel, the 1974. He said is dead. And you can't throw a treaty in the dustbin when it's done between a state and a state. Now, usually when you have governments change, you still have the treaties between between two countries or between two governments, and that does not change a treaty, or it does not change its implementation. So this raises a very huge question mark about Israel's intention in Syria, because obviously it's not only like a buffer zone because there's no government in Syria, now we want to protect ourselves. It's obviously for like something possibly further, for long-term occupation, because again, like having the 1974 ceasefire treaty, like demanding where you have like no military on both sides, you're having like a buffer zone, and then you say this is dead because the government is gone and the Syrian army just withdrew. That is not a good, excuse, or how you represent that you have immediate concerns about no government. But that is obviously not what the statement is all about. So we have to wait and see. And again, like these condemnations coming from Saudi and coming from the UAE, and we know the UAE is part, of course, of the Abraham Accords. So that signals, of course, a potential of hopefully good relations between a possible coming Syrian government and the Arab states. But again, how this government is going to be formed, how is it going to look like, we have to wait and see.
Neil, two questions. What are some of the things that might happen to the Syrian army, people that entered Iraq? Are they going to be resuscitated at some point? Are there Iraqis that'll help them? Are the Iraqis going to help dismantle them? What are your thoughts about the Syrians that fled to Iraq? And my second question is that the Turks could be more aggressive or less aggressive in northeast Syria. One of the aggressive scenarios is they're reasserting this 22-mile operation incursion area into Syrian territory, and that whole thing, and being more irredentist, being more, we're the boss here, we're the winner, we're gonna, push harder on the Kurds. But you can also imagine a scenario where Turkey as the big unexpected winner, i.e. they didn't expect, the operation in Aleppo to turn all of Syria over, and they now have an opportunity to return upwards of 4 million Syrians back to Syria, and that maybe pushing too hard on the Kurds might upset the apple cart, and maybe they're going to be more balanced in their approach to Syria as they try to get the whole thing to work in the way Fadi and Charles and everybody, and Abbas, of course, too, would like things to work out for Syrians, all getting along and not suffering from fractious quarrels along these borderlines.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll start with the first question. And I've been really interested in Charles's obviously historical knowledge, which is fascinating, and sort of having been in Syria at the time that Yazid was moved aside is fascinating. So he might have something to say on this, but just the idea, that sort of now former regime forces have moved over into Iraq is just there's so many delicious ironies around there, right? Having, Hafiz and then Bashar having, accommodated Iraqi opposition groups previously and allowed the flow of, fighters to go from Syria into Iraq, to fight US forces. I mean, just that porous nature of that border and the flip in fortune is really interesting. It can only be guesswork, but I would imagine that those groups, those forces, will want to take succor from other groups, from Iranian-backed groups, certainly in Iraq, and may themselves want to stage some form of insurgency at some point. I think that's probably just a matter of time until that happens. But I mean, that's pure guesswork. But I'm quite optimistic about Syria, but I'm also a hard-nosed realist and see all the challenges that are there. And as those challenges emerge, and as there are major challenges right across the country, I could see sort of former regime soldiers, officers, whatever, wanting to enter into the fray and form their own like I say, insurgency. So that's probably just a matter of time. In terms of Turkey wanting to be more aggressive, or perhaps having a more kind of balanced or a whole of Syria approach.
Yeah, whole of Syria approach. Yeah.
I find that might be something it wishes to achieve, but I think sensitivities around the border areas, concerns about SDF, concerns about PKK will probably determine and dictate that. I think Turkey will go for the more aggressive option as you've described it. Obviously, there's the piece there of US and how does it work and how does it manage that, and that's a long running saw now between the two countries, but I'm not sure that Turkey is going to be willing to sort of sit back and think, okay, let's look at the bigger picture here. Let's concern ourselves less, with sort of Kurdish autonomy, I mean, that's going to be an issue, that's going to be a discussion that's going to be had certainly in Damascus, and that's going to be a very real conversation. And I'm not sure that's one. I mean, Turkey is definitely not going to want to sit back on that. It may want to create facts on the ground in the way that Israel is trying to do so. That's how I would sort of consider Turkey's position.
Charles, some people are saying the Tehran to Beirut land bridge is no more. Some people are saying the Shia Crescent has a big disruption in the middle of it. What are your thoughts on the sort of Iranian influence operation, its proxies, its the axis of resistance? Is it just a matter of time till it comes back, till it reasserts itself, as some of the panelists have alluded to, and you've mentioned something yourself? What are your thoughts on whether this Iranian project in the region?
Iran still has effective control over Iraq. Iraq is a rich oil country with an army, with the Hashid Shabi militias, all of whom are sympathetic to those people who were driven out of Syria, the regime forces, and will probably, as someone just said, be discussing with them ways of getting them back, and also to restore the line to Lebanon and to Hezbollah. Remember, Hezbollah is on its knees now. It's been decapitated, and it's been cut off at the knees both. And it's at a low ebb. It basically surrendered to Israel when it signed that agreement to pull back from the border. And the Iranians are not going to just accept that. They will not take it lying down. They're weakened. They've been hurt. But remember, the Syrian opposition was practically destroyed in 2016 when they were driven out of Homs and Aleppo. Well, now they have Syria. So who knows what's going to happen in the years to come? It depends on how effective and how much the Iranians care to restore that lifeline for Hezbollah, and how important Hezbollah will be to them in the future. And also what happens in Iran itself. If there's a revolution in Iran, then Hezbollah will not be needed, will not be wanted. And this whole axis of resistance will simply go away like slogans do when there's a change of regime.
Abbas, we haven't talked too much about the Tanf base, the training of Syrian special forces by the Americans, the recent loss of Deir Zahor, what the U.S. is doing in the East, and reminding everyone that it was Trump that put the 900 troops in after somebody showed him something like an infographic with oil fields on it, and after what he said about oil in Iraq. But what are your thoughts on the U.S. presence going forward, both before January 20th and after January 20th?
Well, again, that's a good question. We don't know exactly which way the Trump administration is going to go on this one. Firstly, on the presence in the U.S. presence in the South, it's a shaping effort. It's a secondary effort to what's going on with the Kurdish forces on the northeast with the Syrian democratic forces. The forces in the South would mainly to collect intelligence and maybe disrupt some of the supply lines that comes from Syria, from Iran through Iraq all the way to Lebanon. And most of that area was under the Syrian regime and Russian control. Was not U.S. did not have a freedom of maneuver. Basically, it's designed to protect the borders of Jordan and somewhat destroy some of these supply lines. The U.S. main effort continues to be in the northeast, right, with the Syrian democratic forces, and that's, I think, where possibly that we are coming to a clash between the United States and Turkey. I mean, Turkey right now, it's in a good position in Syria, just like Iran, a decade ago, they started to consolidate their effort in Iraq and became really the big player in Iraq. I see Turkey now is doing the same thing in Syria. Turkey becomes and so that the relationship with Turkey is going to depend on what is the United States policy with supporting the Syrian democratic forces in the east. If, Trump, he wants to leave Syria. If that happened, what would happen to those Kurdish elements? Because Turkey will not allow any Kurdish autonomy. Some people might say maybe Syria becomes like Iraq. You'll have a somewhat autonomous Kurdish control in the east, just like you have the Kurdish also autonomous in the northern Iraq. Some kind of situation like this. But again, Turkey is not going to allow that, and we'll see how U.S. and Turkey will square this thing. So we have to wait and see where the U.S. government will insert itself in. But clearly, Turkey is in control, and but again, it's just hard to predict at this moment because people on the ground too, if there's revenge-driven operations against the Alawites in the east, or revenge-driven operations against the Druze in the south, or the Turkish proxies continue their fight against the Syrian Democratic Forces in the north in the Manbij area, that's going to be problematic. So we'll have a Libya-like scenario versus having Iraq-like scenario. So we'll see which way they're going to go. Is it the Libyan route or the Iraq route?
Right. Fadi, two questions. One, you heard what Charles said about Syrian national identity. You heard what Robert Ford said about Syrians needing to learn quickly how to make political deals that they don't have a lot of experience doing. What's on your mind beyond just rejoicing and having a common enemy that's gone? What's on your mind in terms of the modalities of negotiation and reconciliation between Syrians that need to be put in place rather quickly amidst all of this international meddling, which doesn't seem like it's going to stop right away? What are the ways in which Syrians are going to have to engage with each other to not fall prey, to the machinations of the outside powers? And secondly, let's talk a little bit more about the humanitarian side. There are everything Miliband's group is doing, working with the various administrations. There's the Violet organization, there's the White Helmets, there's massive humanitarian needs in Syria. This talk of the port that I made, but can the humanitarian catastrophe that Syrians have been suffering help bring everyone together? And should that be the main focus in the coming weeks, the humanitarian relief, rather than worrying too much about schools and, more sophisticated administrations and social services, and just the basics, getting food, fresh water, electricity, and, should we be, looking at the Syrian humanitarian crisis as a basic needs problem first?
So what I know about the humanitarian side, and there are many people, of course, who are working on the ground who know much more than I do, but I know there are many organizations, taking care of making sure there is food supply, and other things, of course, for running the essential services in the country while, the government collapse. But I know that there are people and many organizations working on the ground to secure the food supply and other essential services. But to my understanding, there have been no much international response to other, possibly more sophisticated, if you want to call it, humanitarian needs. And in particular, here I'm thinking about the issues with humanitarian rescuers are having now, for example, in Sydnaya jail. There is this much sophisticated cells which have codes. It's estimated that possibly still thousands of people are stuck there, and all the organizations which are working on the ground, digging actually to try to get the people out, they don't have the sophistication, the technology, which possibly other more advanced humanitarian organizations may have in the West. Watching closely like how they are working on the ground, I don't see so far enough sufficient international response to this crisis. It has been on media for like 2-3 days now, but only the local organizations are working on their own, trying to find the codes, trying even to find the people who were like the staff of these jails who were working them. But everybody like ran away. So this is a very huge, big challenge, and time is running against them. So locally, the local organizations, in my opinion, are working well, and they are doing more work. They are even like, doing the extra mile, if you want to call it, trying to do what they can, but still international response is very limited. And that takes us perhaps back to the days of the earthquake in 2023, when the international response was very slow, and when it came eventually, it was too late for many people. So that is something I hope will, not be it's already late, but I hope, always being optimistic, hopefully, something will come and, change whatever is going on the ground now. Going back to the first part of your question, Bill, like what are the two things which Syrian people would like to see now? I will possibly think about two immediate concerns. Number one, of course, and if you were asking about the national identity and what is like the form of the state they would like to have, what is the path to this? So I will see it in like two very important things. Number one, of course, reconciliation between all kind of ethnicities, if you want, factions in Syrian societies, including Alawites, Christians, Sunnis, Druze. Reconciliations between those, especially the Alawites, because most of them have been like high rank commanders in the Syrian army. This is very important, but at the same time, prosecution is important. And prosecution for people who were involved in the tortures, in the crimes against the Syrian people, that must be one of the very important things which should come ahead. And that should come ahead under a Syrian government. It should not be done while you still have like the military operation command and still no government in running the country. Doing this without a government will be like revenge against people who were involved. So it should be systematic. It should be under the government, and that is very important for the victims, people who you can't see it on the media, who are going out of these jails. Like many of them are mentally retarded because of the torture they received. So you cannot have a state without doing good to these victims, without prosecuting the people who were involved, and many of them are still there. So there should be reconciliation, but at the time there should be measures taken to find those people and bring them to court and have justice. Only those two things will have a unified, in my opinion, Syrian society which can run under one government. So reconciliation, prosecution, but again, what is an immediate concern now, as I mentioned, like is the humanitarian work on the ground, especially with the issue of the jails.
No country has gotten truth and reconciliation completely right and transitional justice right. South Africa tried the hardest and did a relatively good job compared to the others. Many countries have tried post-conflict to model what their response after the South Africans. No country even got close to what the South Africans had done, which was already flawed in a number of ways. I say this with full optimism. I hope the Syrians can figure out what so many other countries have had such a hard time with. I worked myself a lot on
Rwanda is a good option. Rwanda is a good option.
With the truth and reconciliation, you think they did a good job?
I mean, it's not. Yeah. They're fine now.
I mean, you can have an absence of conflict without getting transitional justice, right? But point taken. Charles, anything we missed? Anything that you wanted to make sure we covered in this event, and your concluding remarks you have, and also, having listened to this conversation, are you? It sounds like you're a little more optimistic than some of our panelists, but not quite as optimistic as at least one other. But where are you in terms of your your optimism for the future? I know you began to speak about that before, but I'm curious where you are now.
Yeah, yesterday, Mohammed al-Bashir, the new prime minister, convened a meeting of ministers from his Salvation government, it's called in Idlib, with the outgoing ministers of the old regime. And it seems that they're going to try and meld the two, the better elements of the two, to create some kind of new government. However, both are compromised. I mean, the regime ministers are compromised, their ministries are compromised. Then when we speak about justice, the Syrian judiciary is compromised. It cannot be relied upon to deliver justice because they participated in convicting those people who were in Sidnaya prison. So you have to find some way of having a whole new system without destroying the institutions the way that Jerry Bremer destroyed the security forces in Iraq and leaving the place open to looting and pillaging. So a mechanism must be found by the old regime, the new regime, to create a brand new regime, which takes the best elements of the two, or that maybe the least dishonest and the least punitive of the two, to create some kind of new system. And that is not easy. That is not easy.
Tunisia got Maastrichtian right, and their democracy lasted for 10 years. Libya got it wrong, and it helped propel them. De-Gaddafization in Libya helped propel them into a similar scenario as what happened in Iraq. Neil, what thoughts do you have? Concluding thoughts? Any other reactions or thoughts about what we may not have covered fully in this panel? You still haven't plugged your book. So now's your opportunity, and any concluding remarks.
Thank you very much. I'll plug my book. It's called Syria, Realism and Action. It's written, intended for undergraduates, students of international relations, politics, etc. It's a sort of, I would describe it, it's only a 40,000 word book. It's light on IR theory and tries to explain how the regime survived until now. It was published on 26th of November, so it came out. It was a very timely publication. The image on the front is actually, if I can just show you, I really struggled with this because it shows Assad and his fatigues, and my publisher was keen to have that, and I consulted a lot of people whether I could have it. I'm now really pleased because that guy left the country and ran away. So the contrast of him being in his fatigues and having fled is, I feel a little bit vindicated. Just some sort of final concluding thoughts. One thing that we haven't really had time to discuss, and we probably wouldn't know, but I'm very interested to see what's going to happen to the Captagon trade now. Obviously, that was a huge revenue generator, for the regime and for other groups on the ground. I've seen some very interesting.
Captagon is an inebriant, and elements of the Assad regime were deeply involved in trafficking it.
Absolutely. Karam Shah and Caroline Rose have done some amazing work on that during the past few years. To sort of see what happens to that and where that tends is something I think we'll all be very interested to see play out. And that sort of takes me, to the goal Fadi had mentioned, the UAE and Saudi Arabia coming out and criticizing what Israel's been doing inside Syria. I haven't seen any statements from Qatar, but I'm sure the Qataris must also be issuing some very strong statements. And, we've seen that they're intending to reopen their embassy very, very soon. And that sort of leads me to think around sort of the reconstruction piece and, one means of sort of encouraging, the Syria body politic as it comes together to work together, to try to think more collectively and work for the whole of Syria. Those are the only guys that got the money, right, to fund the reconstruction. So there are plenty of carrots there to try to encourage that Syrian body politic as it comes together, whether it reforms in March, to sort of move forward. So I think all eyes towards the Gulf in helping Syria move this along.
Abbas, final thoughts?
Well, I am optimistic that the Syrian people may find a way to get together, some kind of reconciliation efforts to do that. But I'm really pessimistic that there are bigger forces, outside forces, Turkey, Russia, Iran, United States, and most importantly, Israel and the Islamists within Syria. Those guys have very strong veto on what goes inside Israel, inside Syria. So I'm not, I'm in the middle right now, but it seems like it's a hard struggle for the Syrian people right now, even though now Assad is gone and he's looking at it from a different perspective. I hope he's not right that he was the glue for it. We'll see.
Fadi, last word.
Oh, I'm optimistic. I feel the hard part of the job was done, which is kicking Assad and his regime out of the country. And since this, long waited for phase of the Syrian revolution has been achieved, I think what comes next is less challenging and possibly more obtainable. The Syrian factions have learned the lesson over the last decade that when they are fighting together, it was only to the benefit and the good of the Syrian regime, with Bashar al-Assad surviving over these infights. Hopefully, the lesson has been learned. So, understanding that only when they came together, they were able to kick out the Assad regime. So, as the lesson was learned over a decade and all that bloodshed which was done, the Syrian revolution is owned by all its people, not by a certain faction, by the people who sacrificed, by the students, by the teachers, by the professors, by the defected officers in the army. So everybody owns this revolution, and I think everybody is going to protect it.
I would like to thank everyone for their time and attention. The National Council is here for you. Send us your ideas. We'll be posting the video on YouTube and on our website, I believe, and there'll be remarks about it in social media. I'd like to thank our panelists for, on short notice, a really high-level discussion of what's next for Syria, and I think it'll have a lot more predictive power than that Doha Forum Syria panel that happened a little too early. I look forward to further discussions on Syria here at the Council and all around the world as we need to dial in and pay attention to what Syria needs in the coming period. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right.
Okay, thank you. Charles,